Welcome back to PHIL 2103, Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics. This is the final lecture in the Free Will series, and this one has to deal with other views on God's perspective. Because when we look at free will, what we're really looking at is a timeline for our life. This is Uncle Bob. If you were to take this class from me in person on campus, you'll hear that I usually use Uncle Bob, a fictitious person, as my object lesson in these. So this is Uncle Bob's life and the various events that have happened along the way. What we're talking about here is, what does God see? This is God in this little bubble up here. And is he seeing the entirety of Bob's life? Is he seeing each individual event? And how does God play into the life of Bob when it comes to Bob's free will? Isaiah 55:8 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." So God's perspective is higher than ours. And inherently that means that any attempt by us to understand what God is seeing, or the way God is in this perspective, is limited. But we do have some ability to see. So now we've already discussed Calvinism, which sees God as sovereign, that is, causing and creating each of the events that happens in our life. We've also seen the Arminian position, which posits that God sees what we will freely choose, and therefore predestination means that it is based on his foreknowledge of what we will inherently choose. Let's talk about some other views of God's providence and perspective. The first one is meticulous providence. Meticulous providence says that whatever happens in nature and in history is completely, exhaustively willed by God, and not merely permitted by God. So meticulous providence would say that tornadoes and events of nature are actually caused by God and not just merely allowed. It also says that whatever happens in history, down to the very events of our lives, are caused by God, not merely permitted. The next is limited providence. Limited providence would say that God could control nature and he could control history meticulously, but he chooses not to. This gives a limited amount of autonomy to both nature and to the human agency. As you can understand from your previous lectures, this falls in line with Arminian positions and theology, saying that God could choose to control every aspect of our lives and every aspect of the nature outside, but chooses in fact to limit himself and allow us to have our own free will within that system. Some other views include process theology. Process theology says that God is growing in his knowledge just as man grows in his knowledge. God is merely a large distance ahead of man and is in his growth. And it is debatable in this case then whether process theology may be accepted as orthodox. Because what it looks like is this. If we were to take Bob's life, Bob has a starting point and will go on into infinity. Each one of us has an eternal future in one direction or another. But Bob has a starting spot. And so from birth to death, Bob is developing over his life. Now, in process theology, God may or may not have a starting point, but God is in development just as a human being. So just as Bob is born and later graduates, moves on to college, becomes an adult, gets married, etc., so God learns from history. The difference between God and this fictitious character Bob here is that God is started way back on the scale. And so God is merely a great distance ahead of us in his advancement. But ultimately, he is still learning and growing, just as human beings would learn and grow. The next view is open theism. Open theism says that God does not know with absolute certainty all that the future holds, but he's able to predict events and respond in such a way that his ultimate and final goals for the future will never be thwarted. This means that God does not control each and every event, and it also says that he doesn't even know exactly what's going to happen in the future. But because he is more powerful, if not all powerful, then God is able to position the world in such a way that his ultimate goals will still happen. But again, God is not all-knowing, and it's debatable whether he is all-powerful in this position. He merely is more knowing and more powerful. Therefore, he is able to concoct ways to make the world and to make history go in the directions he wants it to go. The next of these is middle knowledge. Now, middle knowledge sounds a little bit like it's from a sci-fi show at first, so stay with me on this one. Middle knowledge says that God not only knows what actions an agent will choose, but also all of the possible choices that agent could have chosen. Thus, God did not cause every future certainty, but it allows him to also remain all-knowing. So this is the life of Bob that we've done in class many times. So let's say as Bob goes, it shows that Bob is born, his parents divorced, he's introduced to pornography, starts selling drugs, he's married, has some children, or he himself gets divorced, and then, it goes down the path. Now, let's say right here we have a choice for Bob. Bob has the choice to either sell drugs and go down this path, or to avoid that and therefore go down a different path in life. Again, it seems like it's sci-fi, alternate universe, alternate reality. But the key to middle knowledge is that God knows what Bob will choose, the path that he will walk. But he can also see the branching paths of what Bob could have chosen. So therefore, the fact that there are choice options for Bob, that he could have chosen a different direction, means that God is still in control, he's still all-knowing, but Bob still had real and true free will along the way. That is middle knowledge. Now, before you dismiss any of these positions immediately, let's wrestle with a few scriptures. Some I will give you, others I'm merely going to give you reference to and challenge you to look these up on your own. The first one is Matthew 24:36, in which Jesus, who is by all accounts in Scripture co-equal and co-eternal with the Father, admits that he does not know the hour in which he's returning. It says, I do not know the hour, but only the Father alone. Now, how could Jesus, who is in the Trinity with God, who is God, not know when he is returning? Does this mean that there is a limitation on Jesus' knowing, even if there is not on the Father? The next one is Psalm 139:16. In this, the psalmist declares that God knows every one of our days before we are even born. It says, written in his book is every moment of our lives before we've even taken one breath. And so if this is the case, how could God know everything that is going to happen and not be involved in this some way? And if God knows before we are born every moment of our lives, does that mean we have any measure of freedom at all? Can we be free to choose if God has already seen everything that's going to happen? Isaiah 55:8, God informs us, as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, that he thinks on a much higher plane and that his ways are much greater than we can even comprehend. Joshua 24:15 implies that man may choose or reject God, and yet Ephesians 1:4-5 suggests that we have been chosen either to embrace or reject God. How do we reconcile, therefore, these scriptures? What position, whether it be middle knowledge or Arminianism or Calvinism, which would best fit the understanding of God as presented in Scripture? So allow me to give you a few of my 2 cents on this. First of all, holding to an Arminian system of belief, I believe that each one of us is freely responsible for our own actions. However, I do admit that there are some deterministic factors that influence our lives. These influences, however, are not certainties, neither are they excuses. In my own past history, I come from an alcoholic father who divorced my mother very early in life. And so I have some deterministic factors that play into the way my life could have gone. However, I had the ability to choose or reject my past history of my parents into who I would become. And so there are deterministic factors. However, I believe I freely chose who I ended up becoming. Secondly, while God gives us the gift of pain and consciousness, and note, pain and our conscience are both gifts, each is free to circumvent God's will in his own way. In doing so, however, you make yourself more likely to go away or go a certain direction in your future. That creates a path in life. So it's like this, in my understanding. God gives us free will. He gives us the ability to choose Him or reject Him, just as He did with Adam and Eve. However, every time we choose away from God, we begin to harden our heart towards Him in a way that makes it more difficult to choose towards Him later. Therefore, we are freely choosing, but our choices have consequences. Every time we choose towards God and walk on the path towards Him, it makes it easier to do so in the future. And every time we choose away from God and walk away from Him, it makes it more difficult to choose right things down the path in the future. The third thing I want you to know is that every man and woman chooses his path one step at a time. However, it is more difficult to choose right actions the further down the path you are. So, bearing any sort of supernatural breakthrough, hard-heartedness leads to further hard-heartedness. So this is the illustration I was just using. The further down the path you walk away from God, the more your heart tends to harden towards Him. And just like Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, you begin to start to become calloused towards God. We have the gift of conscience. That is to say, we have a conscience that says, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and we know inside of ourselves. However, at the same time, we can sear our conscience. We can make it so that it is more dull as we go. And therefore, as we start to walk towards that path, it becomes harder and harder to listen to God outside of some form of supernatural breakthrough. Now, I recommended several materials on the last couple of ones, and I wanted to point out the last one. The last one is a book that was previously required in the systematic theology course called Why We're Not Emergent by two guys who should be. And Ted Kluck would be your primary author on there, and then Kevin DeYoung as the secondary. Now, the reason I recommend that book is because when it comes to theology, divergent positions that may seem to be somewhat unorthodox to today's world would be things like the open theism issue. However, these are becoming more and more embraced by quote-unquote progressive Christianity. And so it is a very key thing that you'll need to do in studying this perspective on God's perspective, this view on God's free will and our free will that He has given us, to understand the historic positions and then also to understand some divergent positions that are being taught currently. This has been your exercise in free will. There are many other resources, movies such as The Matrix or The Adjustment Bureau, that would be amazing studies to start to watch and start to pick out whether or not we have free will. The movie I, Robot and The Adjustment Bureau are two of the ones that I most highly recommend in terms of directly tackling this specific topic. So as you watch them, as you see various perspectives on this, start to apply this filter that you've been given and start to see what is it that God knows, and truly, are we free or do we merely have the illusion of freedom? And along the way, you'll have to ask yourself, if you watch those movies, were you truly freely choosing those movies, or was it because I set in place that idea in your head? So you can start to wrap your mind around that one as we move into the next lecture.